Okay, this is part 3. This part is, we'll go over my first contention, which is the early church always taught, all the way up to the time of the Reformation, always taught certain things concerning the resurrection of the just and the advent of Jesus Christ at the time of Antichrist and what will happen. And they always contended, I contend, and I'm giving you historic premillennialism, which is very similar on this point to amillennialism. A literal person referred to as Antichrist makes war against, persecutes, causes tribulation, and does unlawful or unheard of things against us Christians, the saints, the church. In other words, members of the church will be alive at the time of Antichrist and will have to identify and reject him. If then the church is persecuted and put to death by Antichrist, then the resurrection of the just and the rapture of the church must, without any question, happen chronologically after the advent of Antichrist. This will be seen in the expository examination of 2 Thessalonians 2 as well. So Daniel, you see in 2 Thessalonians, Daniel said, remember I used to tell you these things when I was with you, taught them, you can tell because the writings are copied from passages in Daniel. In the early church, the fathers of the early church, when writing on the subject, almost universally cited Daniel chapter 7 and other passages, but especially Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, it says they always interpreted the little horn as Antichrist. And Antichrist makes war and puts to death members of the church. So if Antichrist is putting to death members of the church, the resurrection and rapture hasn't happened previously or prior to that. There are many citations. Augustine said even a guy who's half asleep can see that from Daniel chapter 7, the Antichrist makes war against the church. So his understanding, and all the other church fathers, was that when Daniel spoke of the saints, he was speaking of the Christian church. This is seen universally in the first 4 centuries in all of the writings of the church fathers. Some people may try to say that the Shepherd of Hermas was a dispensationalist, or that Cyprian had dispensational commentary. It's not really the case. You can take some of what they said and twist it and make it support that view, but they weren't of that opinion. Had they been, they would have been labeled as heretics, or they would have been challenged, and we have no historical record of this. In fact, just the opposite is contained in these writings. Dispensationalists will say that the church gets raptured before this period of time, which none of the fathers agree with this, ever taught this, or ever held this interpretation of Scripture. And they will say that Chuck Swindoll, I heard him, wonderful guy, love the guy, but I heard him say that the saints mentioned in Daniel are tribulation saints who get saved after the church is raptured, which there's no such teaching in the Bible, and that is not how the early church ever understood Daniel chapter 7. One of the passages of Scripture that clearly refutes that is Matthew 25, 1 through 13. And in that passage, we're speaking of the groom, who, anyone you ask, well, they'll tell you that's Jesus. The bride, they'll say, is the church. Okay? And when you read the passage, Jesus comes for the church, and after that, the door is closed. People come along afterwards and knock and try to say, let us in. And he says, no, depart from me, for I never knew you. This refutes any possibility of salvation after the resurrection and rapture. So whenever the resurrection and rapture happens, there's no second chance. There's no tribulation saints. There's no Left Behind movies. They're all false. It's a false hope. The resurrection happens, and after that, when the bride comes the groom comes for the bride, after that the door is closed. Verse 13. There is no second chance. Once the rapture and resurrection happens, it's over. It's done.